I had long ago learned the color of invisibility. It was not the crisp, clean absence of white, nor the deep, absorbing nullity of black. It was the color of faded wallpaper, the precise shade of mouse brown that allows a thing to be present in a room yet entirely overlooked. It was the color of my dress, the color of my hair, the color of the quiet, unobtrusive space I was meant to occupy in the world. On the evening of the grandest ball of the season, I was a masterpiece of this particular hue, a walking study in being forgotten. "Do try not to lurk, Alara," my stepmother, Lady Anya, said. Her voice was like honey laced with ground glass, sweet to the unsuspecting ear, but designed to cut. She adjusted the diamond pin in her own resplendent silver hair, her eyes flicking to my reflection in the hall mirror with a distaste so profound it was almost impersonal, as one might view a stain on the upholstery. "You have a simple enough task. It is a great honor, you know. Only a handful of the most distinguished guests will be partaking. Do not spill it." The honor was serving the ceremonial first bloom tea, a rare and fragrant concoction my father had procured at great expense. The task was to carry a silver tray and a delicate porcelain pot through a throng of society's elite, a silent, mobile piece of furniture. It was a way to include me without including me at all, to make me useful in a way that underscored my uselessness. I was not a guest to be presented, but a function to be performed. My stepsister, Rosamond, descended the grand staircase then, a vision in celestial blue, the fabric shimmering like a captured twilight. Diamonds glittered at her throat and in her golden hair. She was everything I was not, vibrant, luminous, effortlessly the center of any room she entered. My father, Lord Valerius, followed her, his face beaming with a pride so naked it was painful to watch. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way he had never seen me. His gaze slid over me, a brief, uncomfortable flicker, before settling back on his jewel, his perfect daughter. He offered her his arm. "You look radiant, my dear," he murmured, his voice thick with adoration. Lady Anya smiled, a triumphant, proprietary expression. "She is the image of her mother," she said, which was her way of saying Rosamond was the image of her. And it was true. They shared the same flawless complexion, the same bright, confident eyes. I, on the other hand, was the ghost of my own mother, a woman my father seemed determined to forget, a quiet academic with her nose always in a book. I had inherited her pensive eyes and her love for the silent language of architecture, passions that had no currency in this glittering world. "Come along, Alara," my father said, his tone distracted, as if reminding a footman to follow with the luggage. I picked up the silver tray, the weight of it a familiar burden on my arms. I was an afterthought, a loose thread in the family tapestry they wished they could snip away. And so I followed them to the carriage, preparing to dissolve into the background, to become one with the wallpaper and the shadows. That was my purpose. That was my place. The ballroom was a galaxy of noise and light. Hundreds of candles burned in crystal chandeliers, their brilliance fracturing into 1,000 tiny rainbows. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and beeswax, and the swelling sound of the orchestra was a physical pressure against my chest. Lady Anya immediately steered Rosamond toward the center of the room, a general deploying her most valuable asset onto the field of battle. My father trailed in their wake, looking pleased and slightly overwhelmed. My own battlefield was smaller, more discreet. I was stationed near a velvet-draped alcove, my silver tray polished to a mirror sheen, the porcelain pot emitting a delicate curl of steam. I was to wait for Lady Anya's signal, a subtle nod before approaching the chosen guests. An aging countess, a wealthy merchant lord, a foreign diplomat. I stood perfectly still, my eyes downcast, practicing the art of being unseen. It was a skill I had perfected over a decade of my stepmother's tutelage. I could stand in a room for an hour and leave no impression, my presence as fleeting as a breath on a cold pane of glass. I watched Rosamond laugh, her head tilted back, a circle of handsome young lords vying for her attention. She was a star, and they were planets caught in her orbit. I felt a familiar, dull ache in my chest. It was not envy, not exactly. I had no desire for that kind of attention. It was the simple, desolate pain of being a footnote in your own family's story. They were the text, bold and beautifully illuminated. I was the margin, blank and empty. Then the music faltered. A ripple of silence spread out from the grand entrance, a wave that momentarily stilled the churning sea of conversation. I lifted my head, curious. A man stood framed in the archway, and the very atmosphere in the room seemed to bend toward him. He was tall and severe, dressed in immaculate black that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. His face was all sharp angles and stark planes, handsome in a way that was intimidating rather than charming. A stillness clung to him, a stark contrast to the swirling motion of the ball. "The Duke of Alistair," someone whispered near me, their voice laced with awe and a little fear. Alistair Vance, the reclusive Duke, a man of immense wealth and power who had not attended a social event in London for nearly 5 years, not since the tragic death of his younger brother. He was a myth, a ghost story parents told their children, and he had arrived. Lady Anya's eyes widened. I could see the calculations flashing behind them, the strategic possibilities rearranging themselves. This was a prize beyond her wildest ambitions. The Duke of Alistair was not merely a good match, he was a king on the social chessboard. She immediately began to move Rosamond into position, a subtle, graceful maneuver that would place her directly in the Duke's path. But the Duke was not moving. He remained at the entrance, his gaze sweeping across the room. It was not the casual glance of a man looking for an acquaintance. It was a slow, methodical assessment, the way a surveyor might study a landscape. His eyes were a startlingly pale gray, like a winter sky, and they seemed to miss nothing. They passed over the glittering chandeliers, the sweating musicians, the preening couples. They passed over Rosamond, poised like a swan for his admiration, and did not linger. His gaze continued its inexorable sweep of the room, and then, impossibly, it stopped. It stopped on me. I was standing in my shadowed alcove, a servant in all but name. There was nothing about me to command a second glance, let alone the focused, unblinking attention of the most powerful man in the room. My heart gave a painful lurch. I must have been mistaken. He was surely looking at the tapestry behind me, or the floral arrangement beside me. I lowered my eyes back to my tray, my hands suddenly trembling so violently that the porcelain cup rattled in its saucer. The sound was a tiny betrayal in the sudden quiet. Just then, Lady Anya gave the signal. The Countess was ready for her tea. I took a steadying breath, forcing my hands to be still. This was my role. This was my reality. The Duke was an illusion, a trick of the light. I stepped out from the alcove, my focus narrowed to the simple task: walk, pour, retreat. I moved toward the Countess, my spine straight, my face a mask of polite neutrality. I could feel his eyes on me with every step. It was a physical sensation, like the heat of a fire. I poured the tea, my movements practiced and smooth despite the frantic hammering in my chest. The Countess gave me a dismissive nod. As I turned to retreat, I saw that Lady Anya had succeeded in cornering her quarry. She stood before the Duke, Rosamond at her side, a triumphant smile gracing her lips. "Your Grace," she said, her voice dripping with reverence. "May I present my daughter, Rosamond?" Rosamond curtsied, a perfect, fluid gesture. "It is an honor to finally meet you, Your Grace," she said, her smile dazzling. The Duke inclined his head, a bare millimeter of movement. His gaze flickered to Rosamond for a fraction of a second before returning, with unnerving intensity, to me. I was frozen halfway back to my alcove, a deer caught in the beam of a lantern. He looked from me to the silver tray in my hands, then to Lady Anya's smug face. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He saw it all, I realized with a sickening lurch. He saw the beautiful daughter being paraded like a prize filly, and he saw the other one, the plain one, being used as a servant. He saw the entire cruel dynamic laid bare. He ignored Rosamond completely. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs of the room like a blade cuts through silk. It was cold, precise, and utterly commanding. "Bring me the one who served the tea," the Duke said, and Rosamond's smile disappeared. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests. Lady Anya's face, a moment before flushed with triumph, had gone chalk white. The triumphant smile was frozen on her lips, a grotesque mask of shock. Rosamond stared, her blue eyes wide with confusion and a dawning humiliation. My father looked as if he wished the floor would swallow him whole, and I stood, rooted to the spot, the silver tray suddenly feeling as heavy as an anchor. Every eye in the ballroom was on me. For a girl who had spent her life perfecting the art of invisibility, the sudden, focused attention of 200 people was a physical assault. My blood roared in my ears. "Ilara," Lady Anya hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "What did you do?" I had done nothing. I had existed. That had always been my crime. A footman, his face a mixture of fear and pity, scurried to my side. "His Grace is asking for you, miss," he stammered, gesturing toward the Duke. I could not move. My feet were fused to the polished floorboards. This had to be a mistake, a cruel joke. Perhaps he meant to reprimand me for rattling the cup. Perhaps he was a man who enjoyed making a public spectacle of the lowly. My mind raced, searching for the most logical and therefore most painful explanation. The Duke's gaze did not waver. He simply waited, his stillness a force of nature. It was clear he would wait all night if he had to. Finally, with the footman's gentle, insistent pressure on my elbow, I began to move. Each step was a torment. The sea of faces parted before me, their expressions a gallery of disbelief, amusement, and contempt. I felt stripped bare, my mouse-brown dress no longer a camouflage, but a mark of shame. I stopped a few feet before him, my eyes fixed on the third button of his black waistcoat. I could not bring myself to meet his gaze. I curtsied, a clumsy, trembling gesture compared to Rosamond's earlier perfection. "Your Grace," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Silence. The entire ballroom held its breath. I waited for the rebuke, the dismissal, the public scorn that must surely be coming. "You are Lord Valerius's daughter," he stated. It was not a question. I managed a nod, still staring at his chest. "Look at me," he commanded. The words were quiet, but they held the unyielding authority of a man who was never, ever disobeyed. Slowly, reluctantly, I lifted my head. I met his eyes. They were even paler up close, flecked with shards of gray and silver. There was no mockery in them, no pity. There was only an intense, unnerving scrutiny, as if he were trying to read something written on my soul. "What is the varietal of the tea?" he asked. The question was so unexpected, so mundane, that it broke through my terror. I blinked. "It is a first-bloom silver needle, Your Grace," I answered automatically. "From the high slopes of the Jian province. It is harvested for only 3 days a year, just before the spring rains." A flicker of something, surprise, interest, crossed his face. "You are well informed," he said. "My mother, she enjoyed botany," I stammered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "She had books." "I see," he said. His gaze shifted for a moment to Lady Anya, who was watching with a look of murderous fury. Then his eyes returned to me. "You will accompany me to the terrace. I find the air in here oppressive." He did not offer me his arm. He simply turned and began to walk, assuming I would follow, and I did. I had no other choice. I handed the tray to the stunned footman and walked behind the Duke of Allister, away from my fuming stepmother and my humiliated sister, through a crowd of whispering, gawking aristocrats, and out into the cool, silent dark of the night. I was no longer invisible. I was something far worse. I was a spectacle. The air on the terrace was a blessed relief, crisp and cold against my flushed cheeks. The cacophony of the ballroom faded to a distant murmur, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the manicured gardens below. The Duke walked to the stone balustrade and stood looking out at the dark expanse of the city, his back to me. I remained near the doorway, unsure of my role in this bizarre play. My mind was a maelstrom of confusion. I replayed the scene in the ballroom, searching for a clue, a reason. His interest in the tea was a flimsy pretext. No man created such a scandalous scene over the provenance of a beverage. This was a statement. But what was he trying to say? And why had he chosen me as his vocabulary? I was convinced this was a calculated move, a stratagem in some high-stakes social game I could not comprehend. Perhaps he was punishing Lady Anya for her transparent ambition. Perhaps he was a man of eccentric, cruel whims. Hope was a luxury I had learned long ago I could not afford. It was far safer to assume the worst. He turned, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the city. "Your hands were trembling," he said, his voice quiet in the stillness. I flinched, instinctively hiding my hands in the folds of my drab skirt. I was nervous, Your Grace. I feared I would spill the tea." "You were not nervous," he countered, his tone flat and certain. "You were disciplined. There is a difference. You willed your hands to be steady. I saw it." I said nothing. His perception was unsettling, as if he had peeled back a layer of my skin and looked at the mechanics beneath. "Your stepmother gives you a servant's task at the most important ball of the season," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "She places you in a corner, dressed to be overlooked. Yet you perform your humiliating duty with a dignity she herself does not possess. Why?" The question hung in the air between us. It was a direct, brutal inquiry into the heart of my existence. No one had ever asked me such a thing. No one had ever looked closely enough to even formulate the question. I felt a sudden, sharp sting behind my eyes. "It is my place, Your Grace," I whispered, the answer tasting like ash in my mouth. "Is it?" he asked softly. He took a step closer. "I do not think so." The summons arrived the next morning, a crisp, cream envelope bearing the severe, unadorned crest of the Duke of Alastair. It was delivered by a groom in livery so immaculate it made our own household staff look shabby. My father read it, his face paling. Lady Anya snatched it from his hand. "He has invited her to Blackwood Manor," she breathed, her voice a dangerous compound of fury and disbelief. "To his residence, alone. It says for tea," my father offered weakly. "It is likely just a courtesy after last night's scene." "A courtesy?" Lady Anya laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Alastair Vance does not perform courtesies. He is a predator and he has scented something." "What did you say to him, you foolish girl?" she rounded on me, her eyes blazing. "Nothing," I said, my own voice trembling slightly. "He asked about the tea. He observed that my hands were shaking." "And you thought to win his pity with a display of meekness," she sneered. "Do not be a fool. Men like him are not won by pity, they are won by beauty, by wit, by spirit, by everything you lack." She crumpled the invitation in her fist. "You will not go." "She must," my father said, surprising us both. He looked at his wife, a flicker of something, fear, resolve, in his eyes. "To refuse the Duke of Alastair would be a mortal insult. We would be ruined. She will go." And so, I went. Dressed again in my most unobtrusive gray dress, I rode in our second-best carriage to the imposing gates of Blackwood Manor. The house was not a home, it was a fortress. Built of dark, weathered stone, it loomed over its grounds with a severe, monastic solemnity. It was beautiful in a stark, uncompromising way. It was the architectural embodiment of the man himself. I was met at the door by a housekeeper, a woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and a face that looked as if it had never learned to smile. "Miss Alara," she said, her voice formal. "His Grace is expecting you. This way." She led me through halls of echoing marble and shadowy portraits. There were no flowers, no frivolous decorations. The only adornments were the bones of the house itself, the soaring arches, the intricate carvings in the dark wood, the sheer, breathtaking scale of the spaces. We arrived at a pair of massive oak doors. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, opened one and announced me. "Miss Alara Valerius, Your Grace." I stepped inside and my breath caught in my throat. I was in a library, but to call it a library was like calling the ocean a pond. It was a cathedral of books. 2 stories of shelves soared toward a vaulted ceiling, where intricate frescoes depicted constellations and astronomical charts. A rolling ladder leaned against one wall, a silent invitation to the upper realms of knowledge. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and lemon oil. In the center of this magnificent room, bathed in the light from a towering arched window, was a massive table. It was not covered with books, but with architectural drawings. The Duke stood beside the table, a pair of calipers in his hand. He was not dressed in formal black, but in a simple white shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment, he seemed less like a fearsome duke and more like a scholar, engrossed in his work. "Miss Alara," he said, his voice softer here, in his own domain. "Thank you for coming." He gestured to the drawings. "Come, look at this." Timidly, I approached the table. The drawings were exquisitely detailed renderings of Roman aqueducts. Cross-sections, stress diagrams, studies of arch construction. "The Pont du Gard," I breathed, recognizing the iconic structure instantly. His eyes sharpened. "You know it." "Only from books," I said, my gaze tracing the elegant lines of the drawing. "It is a masterpiece of engineering. The precision of the gradient, the sheer audacity of the span." I trailed off, flushing, embarrassed by my own enthusiasm. He ignored my embarrassment. He tapped a point on one of the cross-sections with his calipers. "The engineers who built this did not use mortar for the primary structure. The stones are held by friction and gravity alone. The precision of the cutting had to be nearly perfect. But look here," he pointed. "At the base of the third tier, modern surveys suggest a minor flaw in the foundational bedrock. How would you have compensated for that if you were the master builder?" I stared at him. He was asking for my opinion. My technical opinion on architecture. My heart began to beat a new, unfamiliar rhythm. It was not fear. It was a tentative, terrifying flicker of excitement. I began, hesitant. I leaned closer, studying the diagram. The world outside this room, my stepmother, the ball, my own insignificance, faded away. There was only the drawing, the problem, the pure, clean logic of stone and stress. I would not have tried to correct it at the base. The risk of shearing would be too great. I would have distributed the load differently across the upper tiers, perhaps by using a series of smaller, lighter keystones in the secondary arches, shifting the center of mass almost imperceptibly westward, away from the flaw. I looked up at him, expecting him to mock my amateur speculation. Instead, he was watching me with that same intense, unreadable expression from the night before. But now I saw something else in it: recognition. "That is precisely what a new analysis suggests they did," he said quietly. "A solution of elegance and foresight." He put down the calipers. "At the All Counties Fair, 7 years ago, there was a youth exhibition. A portfolio of drawings was submitted, sketches of local barns, churches, detailed studies of their joinery, their roof trusses. They were remarkable for their understanding of structural integrity. The portfolio was submitted under the name E. Valerius. It won no prize. The judges deemed the subject matter unladylike." I stared at him, my blood turning to ice, then to fire. I had been 14. I had poured my heart into those drawings. When they were dismissed, a part of me had withered. I had never drawn so seriously again. I had hidden that part of myself away, convinced of its worthlessness. "You saw them?" I whispered. "I was one of the judges," he said. "I was outvoted." He paused, his gaze holding mine. "I have never forgotten them." In that moment, the entire world shifted on its axis. His interest was not a whim. It was not a stratagem. It was a 7-year-old memory of a girl he had never met, a girl who understood the language of stone and wood. He had not seen a plain, awkward creature in a corner. He had seen the artist who had drawn the barns. He had seen me. A shiver ran through me, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. He noticed it at once. He turned and pulled a heavy wool shawl from the back of a chair. It was a deep, rich burgundy, soft and warm. He draped it over my shoulders himself. His fingers brushed the back of my neck, a brief, impersonal contact that felt like a brand. "The chill in this house is formidable," was all he said. Mrs. Gable entered silently with a tea service, and this time the tea was for me. As I left an hour later, my mind reeling, he pressed a book into my hands. It was a large, leather-bound volume, heavy and smelling of age. De Architectura by Vitruvius, a rare, illustrated edition. I looked up at him, speechless. "I imagine you will find it more interesting than silver needle tea," he said. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that utterly transformed his severe face. "We will discuss it next week." And so it began. Our meetings in his library became a weekly ritual, a secret island of sanity in the turbulent sea of my life at home. Lady Anya was beside herself with rage, but she was powerless. A direct command from the Duke of Allister was not something one could refuse. She contented herself with a campaign of small, daily cruelties, a forgotten place setting at dinner, a constant stream of cutting remarks about my dress, my posture, my foolish fantasies. I endured it all, my spirit armored by the memory of the library, by the promise of the next meeting. Those hours with Allister, for he soon insisted I use his name, at least within the stone walls of his fortress, were like breathing after being held underwater. We rarely spoke of the world outside. We spoke of barrel vaults and flying buttresses, of the mathematical beauty of a Fibonacci spiral in a nautilus shell and a cathedral rose window. He would pose a problem, a question of design or history, and I would spend the week poring over the books he lent me, formulating my answer. It was a courtship of the mind, a conversation that had been waiting 7 years to happen. He listened to me. It was a simple thing, but it was a gift I had never been given. He would lean forward, his chin resting on his hand, his pale eyes focused on my face as I spoke, and he would listen with an intensity that made me feel as if my words were the most important things in the world. My voice, once hesitant and small, grew stronger, more confident. I found myself articulating thoughts I didn't even know I had, my ideas taking shape in the respectful silence he provided. One afternoon, we were examining the plans for the Beauvais Cathedral, a structure famous for its soaring ambition and its catastrophic collapses. I was tracing the lines of the choir vault, which had failed just a dozen years after its construction. "They were too ambitious," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "They pushed the stone past its limits. They valued height more than stability. It was vanity." A shadow passed over Allister's face. He looked away from the drawing, his gaze fixed on the rain lashing against the tall window. His jaw was tight, the muscle clenching and unclenching. "Vanity can be a dangerous architect," he said, his voice low and strained. The air in the room grew heavy. I had learned to read his moods, to recognize the subtle signs of the sorrow that haunted him. This was a deep shadow, a place I had not seen before. "My brother Thomas," he began, and the name hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. He had never spoken it before. "He was 17. He loved botany, just as your mother did. Our father built a new conservatory for him at our country estate. Glass and iron, the most modern design, a triumph of engineering, the architect called it." He fell silent. I waited, my heart aching for the story I knew was coming. "It was winter," he continued, his voice rough. "A heavy snow. I was supposed to meet him there. I was late. There was a flaw in the design, a miscalculation in the load-bearing capacity of the iron trusses. The weight of the snow, it was too much. The entire structure collapsed." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were hollow, filled with a grief so raw it was like an open wound. "They said if I had been on time, I would have died with him. For years, I have thought that I should have been. I should have seen the flaw. I was older. I studied the plans. But I was distracted, arrogant. I saw only the beauty, not the weakness." His carefully constructed facade of severity had crumbled, and in its place was a man drowning in guilt. He had not built the conservatory, but he had condemned himself for its failure. His obsession with architecture, with structural integrity, was not just an intellectual pursuit. It was a penance. It was his way of trying to control the unforgiving laws of physics that had stolen his brother. I did not know what to say. The facile words of comfort died in my throat. Instead, I simply reached across the table and laid my hand on his. It was a small, impulsive gesture of shared humanity, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. His skin was cold, but he did not pull away. He turned his hand over and his fingers curled around mine, his grip surprisingly strong, almost desperate. We sat there for a long moment in the gathering dusk, the rain beating a steady rhythm on the glass, my small hand enveloped in his. It was not the touch of a lover, not yet. It was the touch of two lonely people finding an anchor in a storm. The air was electric with unspoken things. Finally, as if realizing the boundary that had been crossed, he released my hand, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second too long. He cleared his throat and stood up, turning his back to me once more to stare out the window. But the space between us had changed. A wall had come down, and in its place, a fragile bridge was being built. The shift was not lost on Lady Anya. My weekly visits, once a source of irritation, now became a source of genuine alarm. The whispers in society had grown louder. The reclusive Duke was courting the plain, invisible stepsister. It was a scandal, an aberration, an affront to the natural order of things. It was a direct threat to her plans for Rosamond, who was still fielding offers, but none as spectacular as the one that now seemed to be slipping through their fingers. Lady Anya's demeanor toward me changed. The open contempt was replaced by something more insidious, a cloying, false sweetness in public, and a cold, calculating venom in private. She began to see me not as a worthless burden, but as a rival pawn on the board, one she needed to remove. Her first move was subtle. A book Alistair had sent for me, a treatise on Gothic vaulting, went missing. "Oh dear," Lady Anya had said, her eyes wide with false innocence. "The new scullery maid must have misplaced it. They are so careless." I knew with sickening certainty that she had taken it, perhaps even destroyed it. It was a small act, but it was a declaration of war. Her next move was far more audacious. One afternoon, as I prepared for my visit to Blackwood Manor, she entered my room without knocking. She held a letter in her hand, her expression one of grim satisfaction. "Your little fantasy is over, Ilara," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "Lord Grummel has made an offer for your hand." Lord Grummel. A baron twice my father's age, a man whose lands were mortgaged to the hilt and whose reputation was built on boorish behavior and a fondness for drink. He was odious, a vulture circling the marriage market for a dowry to pay his debts. "No," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. "Father would never." "Your father has agreed," she cut in sharply. "The contract will be signed this evening. It is a suitable match for you. You should be grateful. Lord Grummel is not particular about looks or eccentricities." Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. This was a cage, and the door was swinging shut. To be married to Grummel would be a living death, a final, irrevocable extinguishing of the small flame of hope Alistair had kindled in me. "I will not do it," I said, my own voice surprising me with its strength. Lady Anya's eyes narrowed to slits. "You have no choice. You are a silly, ungrateful girl who has gotten notions far above her station. The Duke of Alistair is toying with you. Can you not see that? A man of his stature does not marry a nobody. He is amusing himself with your novelty. But the game is over. You will be a baroness. It is more than you deserve." She left, and I sank onto my bed, the room spinning. She was wrong about Alistair. I knew she was. What we shared was real. But she was right about my powerlessness. I was my father's daughter, his property to dispose of as he saw fit. And my father was a weak man who would always choose the path of least resistance, the path his wife laid out for him. But her assault was not finished. Unbeknownst to me, she had already launched her most venomous attack. She had paid her lady's companion to pen an anonymous letter to the Duke. It was a masterpiece of cruelty, a carefully crafted fiction that painted me as a pathetic, mentally unstable creature. It claimed I had been pathologically obsessed with him since I was a child, that my interest in architecture was a recent fabrication to trap him, that I was prone to fits of delusion and fantasy. It was designed to turn his intellectual admiration into disgust, to curdle his sympathy into contempt. It was a poisoned dart aimed at the very heart of our connection. I knew nothing of this as I sat in my room, staring at the walls, the bars of my cage closing in. I had one hope, one desperate, slim chance. I had to reach Alistair. I had to tell him what was happening. But how? I was a prisoner in my own home. My visit for the day had been cancelled by a curt note from my stepmother. The trap was sprung. I wept. Not loud, racking sobs, but the silent, hopeless tears of the truly defeated. The color of invisibility was returning, flooding my world, and this time it was the color of despair. The letter arrived at Blackwood Manor like a snake slithering under the door. Alistair read it once, his face impassive. He read it a second time, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The words were vile, a tapestry of lies woven with just enough truth to seem plausible to a stranger. It spoke of a girl who stalked the edges of society, her eyes always fixed on the Duke, of a pathetic obsession that had blossomed into a cunning, manipulative scheme. But Alistair was not a stranger. He knew the girl who drew barns with a master's understanding of structure. He knew the woman who could debate the merits of groin vaults versus rib vaults, whose quiet intelligence shone brighter than any diamond. He recognized the cruelty in the letter's elegant script. He recognized the voice of Lady Anya. He did not for 1 second believe it. But he did recognize it for what it was, an act of desperation. And desperate people, he knew, were dangerous. He did not burn the letter. He placed it carefully on his desk. Then he pulled a cord, summoning his man of affairs, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient solicitor named Finch. Within the hour, Finch and a team of quiet, well-paid investigators were at work. They were tasked with 2 things: to uncover the author of the letter and to discover everything they could about Lord Valerius's household, particularly any arrangements being made concerning his eldest daughter. The results came back with astonishing speed. The source of the letter was traced to a scribe frequently used by Lady Anya's companion. The forced betrothal to Baron Grummel was confirmed, the contracts already drawn up. But Finch's men, being thorough, had dug deeper. They had investigated the finances of the Valerius family, specifically the estate of Alara's late mother. And there they found it, the grand prize. Alara's mother, herself the daughter of a wealthy quarry owner, had left her entire personal fortune not to her husband, but in a trust for her daughter, to be administered by Lord Valerius until Alara came of age or married. It was a substantial inheritance centered around a series of valuable granite and marble quarries. An inheritance that Lord Valerius had never mentioned, and from which Lady Anya had been steadily and illegally siphoning funds for years to finance her lavish lifestyle and Rosamond's social campaigns. They were not just cruel, they were thieves. Alistair read the final report, his face a mask of cold fury. The pieces clicked into place. The cruelty, the suppression, the sudden desperate need to marry Alara off to a controllable lout. It was all to protect their secret, to ensure the true heiress never discovered her own wealth and power. He sent out 3 invitations, one to Lord Valerius, Lady Anya, and Rosamond, requesting their presence to discuss a matter of great urgency regarding Alara. One to Baron Grummel, hinting at a finalization of the marriage arrangements under the Duke's powerful patronage. And a final, private note to me, delivered by his own trusted groom, who slipped it into my hand as I walked in the garden, the only place I was allowed to go. It contained only 5 words: "Come to me, trust me." The next afternoon, the players assembled in the great library at Blackwood Manor. Lady Anya entered with an air of triumphant certainty, believing she had been summoned to witness the Duke's dismissal of me. Baron Grummel was puffed up with self-importance, preening in his tight waistcoat. My father looked nervous and shifty, while Rosamond simply looked confused. I was already there, standing beside Alistair near the great fireplace. He had greeted me with a quiet intensity, his eyes searching my face. I had simply handed him the note he had sent. Trust me, I had chosen to. It was the bravest thing I had ever done. He had placed my hand on his arm, and there I stood, my heart hammering but my spine straight. "Thank you all for coming," Alistair began, his voice calm and dangerously quiet. He did not invite them to sit. I have called you here to address a series of disturbing events concerning Miss Ilara." Lady Anya smiled thinly. "Your Grace, if this is about her fanciful notions—" "It is about this," Alistair said, holding up the anonymous letter. "A document filled with malicious lies, which my agents have traced directly to your companion, Lady Anya." My stepmother's face went rigid. The color drained from it. I have no idea what you are talking about." "I am sure you do not," Alistair said, his voice laced with ice. "It also concerns this." He produced another document. "A marriage contract consigning Miss Ilara to this man," he gestured dismissively at Grummel. "A man whose debts are as well known as his lack of character. A desperate move to silence her and remove her from London." Baron Grummel sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Now see here, this is an arrangement between gentlemen." "You, sir, are no gentleman," Alistair said, his gaze pinning the Baron to the spot. "You are a parasite. I suggest you leave my house now, before I decide to purchase your debts and have you thrown in prison." The Baron, his bravado evaporating, gave a strangled squeak and practically fled the room. Alistair turned his attention back to my family. "But the real issue, the true reason for all this cruelty and deception, is this." He laid a thick legal folio on the table. "The last will and testament of the late Lady Isidora Valerius, Ilara's mother. A document I believe you have done your utmost to suppress." My father made a small choking sound. "It states, quite clearly," Alistair continued, his voice resonating with cold authority, "that her entire personal fortune, including the Blackwood quarries and all associated holdings, were left in trust to her daughter, Ilara. A trust which you, Lord Valerius, have failed to administer, and which you, Lady Anya, have been systematically plundering for the past 10 years. He looked at my stepmother, his eyes blazing with contempt. "You have been funding your daughter's wardrobe with this young woman's inheritance. You have been living a lie, paid for by theft." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Rosamond's sharp intake of breath. Lady Anya stared at the folio, her face a mask of horror. The game was over. The board was overturned. "Lies!" she finally shrieked, her voice cracking. "It's all lies! She has bewitched him! The girl is a conniving, unnatural little snake." And then a strange calm settled over me. I looked at this woman, who had spent a decade trying to erase me, now reduced to a hissing, cornered animal. I felt the steady pressure of Alistair's hand on my arm. He had not given me a voice, not truly. He had simply built a space where I could finally find my own. I stepped forward. "No, Lady Anya," I said. My own voice sounded clear and strong in the vast room. "I am not a snake. I am not a ghost. I am a person. And you have spent my entire life trying to make me forget that." I turned to my father, his face gray with shame. "You stood by and watched. You let her dim every light inside me because you were too weak to confront her. You wanted a quiet life, even if it was built on my silence, on my unhappiness." Finally, I looked at my stepmother. "You did not steal my money. You tried to steal myself. You told me I was plain, so I would not look in a mirror. You told me I was quiet, so I would not speak. You told me I was worthless, so I would believe it. You wanted a ghost in your house, a shadow that would never challenge your daughter's light. But the thing about shadows is that they are cast by something solid. And I am solid. I am here." I stopped, my chest heaving, the exhilarating, terrifying rush of truth pouring through me. I had spoken. After a lifetime of silence, I had spoken my truth. Lady Anya was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. My father bowed his head, a broken man, and Rosamond, her face streaked with tears, took a hesitant step toward me. "Ilara," she whispered, her voice choked with a dawning, horrified understanding. I never knew." She looked from her mother's twisted face to my own, and in that moment, she finally saw. She crossed the space between us and took my free hand. "Forgive me." Alistair raised his voice one last time. "These documents," he said, tapping the folio, have been filed with the courts. Miss Alara's inheritance is restored, effective immediately. She is now one of the wealthiest unmarried women in England. As for you, Lady Anya, my lawyers advise that a prosecution for theft would be quite successful. However, Miss Alara is merciful. He looked at me, a silent question. I gave a slight shake of my head. I did not want vengeance. I wanted freedom. You will leave London, Alistair commanded. You will retire to your husband's most remote country estate. And you will not return. If you do, or if you cause Miss Alara any further distress, I will see you ruined utterly. Am I understood? Lady Anya stared at him, her eyes filled with pure hatred, but she was defeated. She gave a jerky nod, grabbed my father's arm, and pulled him from the room without a backward glance. Rosamond lingered, her hand still clutching mine. I will write to you, she promised, her eyes full of remorse. Then she too was gone, and we were alone. The silence that descended upon the library was profound. It was the silence after a storm, clean and ringing. The ghosts of the last hour faded, leaving only the two of us standing in the soft afternoon light, surrounded by a universe of books. My legs suddenly felt weak, and I swayed. Alistair's hand tightened on my arm, steadying me. He led me to a large leather armchair by the fire and gently pushed me into it. I stared into the flames, my mind a blank. The confrontation, the release of a decade of suppressed pain and anger, had left me utterly hollowed out. I had won, my tormentor was vanquished, my future was my own. But the victory felt distant, unreal. I was trembling again, a deep internal tremor that shook me to my bones. Alistair knelt before my chair. He did not speak. He simply took my cold hands in his warm ones and held them. We stayed like that for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the grand clock in the hall. He was giving me time to come back to myself, to inhabit this new, unfamiliar reality. When I could finally meet his eyes, I saw none of the cold Duke, none of the severe strategist. I saw only Alistair. His pale eyes were filled with a deep, quiet tenderness that made my heart ache. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice rough with emotion. A tear I hadn't known was there slid down my cheek. "You did it," I whispered. "You saved me." He shook his head, his grip on my hands tightening. "No, Alara, do not ever think that. I did not save you. All I did was hold up a mirror so you could finally see the strength that was in you all along. I did not give you a voice. I only created a space where it could finally be heard." He looked around the library, at the soaring shelves, the sturdy beams, the solid stone walls. "I have spent my life studying structures," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Structures that can bear great weight, that can withstand storms and the slow, relentless pressure of time. I look at you, and I see that same integrity, that same resilience. You have a foundation of granite, Alara." He let go of one of my hands and gently brushed the tear from my cheek with his thumb. His touch was electric. "I did not set out to find you. I had resigned myself to a life of solitude, of penance. But I saw you, that night at the ball, a quiet light in a loud room, and I recognized you. Not from a 7-year-old memory, but as the other half of a design I did not know I was incomplete without." He rose to his feet and stood before me, tall and serious. "I am not a man for poetry, Alara. I am a man of structure, of permanence. I believe we are such a structure, a partnership that can bear any weight. I am asking you to build a life with me. Will you be my wife?" He was not rescuing me. He was not offering me a title or protection. He was offering me a partnership. He was asking me to be his equal, the master builder of a life we would design together. The hollow space inside me filled with a light so bright it was almost painful. It was the light of being seen, of being known, of being valued not in spite of my quiet nature and my scholarly passions, but because of them. "Yes," I said, the word a breath, a vow. "Yes, Alistair." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the one I had only seen a ghost of before. It was like watching the sun rise over a winter landscape. He reached down and drew me to my feet. He framed my face with his hands, his gaze searching mine, as if to memorize every line. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of profound recognition. It was the end of a very long winter, the closing of a book on a life of silence and sorrow. It was the feeling of coming home to a place you had only ever dreamed of. It was solid, it was real, it was the beginning of everything. A year later, I stood on the balcony of Etheria House, my hand resting on the cool stone balustrade that I had helped design. The house was ours, Alistair's and mine. It was not a fortress like Blackwood Manor, but a home filled with light and air, its elegant lines speaking of welcome rather than defense. Below, the city of London sprawled out, a tapestry of gray and gold under the afternoon sun. Alistair came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and pulling me back against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his presence a warm, solid comfort. "What is my wife, the Duchess of Alistair, contemplating so seriously?" he murmured into my hair. I smiled, leaning back into his embrace. On a table beside us, architectural plans were weighted down against the breeze. They were the designs for the new Isadora Vance Memorial Library, a public institution dedicated to the sciences and arts, funded entirely by the profits from my quarries. My mother's legacy, and now mine, given back to the world. "I was thinking about the color of invisibility," I said softly. "I used to think it was the color of a mouse or a shadow, something to be ignored." He was silent for a moment, his arms tightening around me. "And now?" "Now I think there is no such thing," I answered, turning my head to look at him. His pale eyes were warm, his love for me a steady, unwavering light. "There are only people who choose not to see. I was never invisible. I was just waiting for an architect who knew how to read the plans." He smiled, that slow, wonderful smile that was reserved only for me. He kissed me, a gentle press of his lips that spoke of quiet contentment and shared days stretching out before us. A life built on a foundation of mutual respect, a meeting of minds, and a love as strong and enduring as the stone from my own quarries. I was no longer a footnote, no longer a ghost. I was the Duchess. I was an architect. I was Alara. And I was, finally and completely, seen.